The morning sun glinted off the Seine's murky surface as Tyler Mislawchuk stretched his arms, his eyes fixed on the water that would soon become his battleground. The Canadian triathlete couldn't help but chuckle at the irony of it all. Here he was, about to dive into a river that had been the subject of more headlines than a Kardashian wedding, all in the name of Olympic glory. "Well, Tyler," he muttered to himself, "at least you won't have to worry about sharks." The air buzzed with nervous energy as athletes from around the world gathered at the starting line. Mislawchuk's mind drifted to his last Olympic experience, or lack thereof. The phantom ache in his Achilles served as a bitter reminder of the Tokyo Games that never were. But today was different. Today, he was ready to show the world what he was made of, even if it meant swallowing half the Seine in the process. A nearby French official droned on about water quality improvements, his words as convincing as a politician's promise. Mislawchuk tuned him out, focusing instead on the task at hand. He'd trained for this moment, pushing his body to its limits in the frigid Canadian waters. Surely, a little Parisian sewage couldn't be worse than dodging ice floes in Lake Ontario. The starting gun fired, and Mislawchuk plunged into the river with the grace of a caffeinated seal. The water, surprisingly warm, enveloped him like a questionable embrace from a distant relative. He fell into rhythm, his powerful strokes propelling him forward as he tried not to think about the microscopic party happening in his mouth with every breath. Halfway through the swim, Mislawchuk found himself in a comfortable position near the front of the pack. His confidence grew with each stroke, and he allowed himself a moment of optimism. Maybe the naysayers were wrong. Maybe the Seine wasn't the toxic soup everyone had made it out to be. It was then, in that brief moment of hope, that he felt it. A gurgle in his stomach that had nothing to do with pre-race jitters. Mislawchuk pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the transition area ahead. He had a race to win, after all. No time for second thoughts now. Mislawchuk surged forward, his arm slicing through the murky water like a hot knife through butter. The Seine, for all its infamous reputation, felt surprisingly accommodating, at least for the moment. Around him, a frenzy of limbs churned the river into a frothy mess. Elbows flew, feet kicked, and the occasional mouthful of water found its way down unsuspecting throats. Mislawchuk, no stranger to the chaos of open water swimming, navigated the melee with the finesse of a seasoned pro. Just keep swimming, he chanted internally, channeling his inner Dory. The mantra worked until a rogue wave, courtesy of a particularly enthusiastic competitor, slapped him square in the face. Spluttering, Mislawchuk inadvertently gulped down a mouthful of Seine water. The taste was unique, a bouquet of centuries-old Parisian history, with notes of questionable sanitation and a hint of baguette. He made a mental note to avoid wine tasting for the foreseeable future. Pushing the thought aside, he redoubled his efforts. The transition area loomed ahead, a beacon of hope in this aquatic obstacle course. Mislawchuk's muscles burned with exertion, but he pressed on, determined to make up for lost time in Tokyo. As he neared the exit point, a strange sensation bubbled up in his gut. He dismissed it as pre-race jitters, focusing instead on the task at hand. With a final burst of energy, Mislawchuk hauled himself out of the water, stumbling slightly as he found his land legs. The transition area was a blur of motion and shouted encouragement. Mislawchuk moved on autopilot, stripping off his wetsuit and donning his cycling gear with practiced efficiency. He grabbed his bike, ready to tackle the next leg of the race. It was then that the first warning sign hit him. A gurgle, more insistent than before, rumbled through his stomach. Mislawchuk gritted his teeth, determined not to let a little gastrointestinal discomfort derail his Olympic dreams. He mounted his bike, pushing off with a powerful stroke. The Parisian streets stretched out before him, a challenging course that would test even the most seasoned cyclist. Mislawchuk leaned into the first turn, his body a streamlined missile cutting through the air. But as he picked up speed, the gurgle in his stomach grew to a roar. The Seine, it seemed, wasn't done with him yet. Mislawchuk pedaled harder, as if he could outrun the impending disaster. His face, A mask of determination betrayed none of the internal struggle raging within. The crowd cheered as he whizzed by, oblivious to the time bomb ticking away in his gut. Mislawchuk focused on the road ahead, counting down the kilometers until the run portion. Just a little longer, he told himself. Just a little longer, he told himself, gritting his teeth as he rounded the final bend of the cycling course. The transition area loomed ahead, a mirage of relief in the sweltering Parisian heat. Mislawchuk dismounted with the grace of a newborn giraffe, his legs wobbling beneath him as he racked his bike. The run portion stretched before him like an endless ribbon of asphalt. Mislawchuk's stomach churned in protest, but he pushed forward, his feet pounding the pavement in a desperate rhythm. The Seine's parting gift sloshed inside him with each step, a liquid reminder of the morning's aquatic adventure. "Come on, Tyler," he muttered through clenched teeth. "You didn't come this far to be taken out by a river with delusions of grandeur." The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the city of light into a sauna of Olympic proportions. Mislawchuk's Canadian blood rebelled against the heat, longing for the crisp chill of a Manitoba morning. He'd trained for this, visualized every step of the course, but nothing could have prepared him for the perfect storm of Seine-induced nausea and Parisian summer swelter. Spectators lined the route, their cheers a cacophony of encouragement. Mislawchuk managed a weak smile, silently praying they couldn't see the internal battle raging beneath his sweat-soaked uniform. He passed the halfway point, each kilometer feeling longer than the last. "Water?" a volunteer called out, thrusting a cup in his direction. Mislawchuk shook his head vehemently. The mere thought of adding more liquid to his roiling stomach was enough to make him want to curl up in the fetal position right there on the Champs-Élysées. With 2 kilometers to go, Mislawchuk found himself in 9th place. Not the podium finish he'd dreamed of, but a respectable showing considering the circumstances. He dug deep, channeling every ounce of determination he could muster. The finish line beckoned, a shimmering oasis of relief. "You've got this, mate!" an Australian competitor shouted as he passed. "Looking strong." If only he knew, Mislawchuk thought wryly. He felt about as strong as a wet noodle in a hurricane. But there was no turning back now. He'd come to Paris to prove himself, to banish the ghosts of Tokyo and show the world what he was capable of. The final stretch loomed ahead. Mislawchuk's vision narrowed, focused solely on the finish line. His legs moved on autopilot, each step a small miracle of perseverance. The roar of the crowd grew louder, a wall of sound pushing him forward. With a final burst of energy, Mislawchuk crossed the finish line, 9th place. Not bad for a guy who just unwittingly participated in an impromptu Seine water tasting. He stumbled to a stop, hands on his knees, gulping air like a fish out of water. For a moment, relief washed over him. He'd done it. He'd conquered the Paris course, Seine and all. But as the adrenaline faded, that familiar gurgle returned with a vengeance. Mislawchuk's eyes widened as he realized the battle wasn't over yet. In fact, the real fireworks were about to begin. He straightened up, searching desperately for the nearest trash can or secluded spot. But before he could make his escape, a microphone was thrust in his face. A perky reporter with a megawatt smile materialized beside him, her cameraman in tow. "Tyler Mislawchuk! Congratulations on your impressive finish! How are you feeling right now?" Mislawchuk swallowed hard, tasting bile. I'm feeling..." He trailed off, his stomach performing somersaults that would make an Olympic gymnast jealous. The reporter, oblivious to his distress, pressed on. "You really gave it your all out there today. Can you walk us through your strategy?" Strategy? The only strategy Mislawchuk could think of right now involved finding the nearest bush. He forced a weak smile, willing his rebellious gut to behave for just a few more minutes. "Well, it's all about pushing yourself to the limit," he managed, his voice strained. "And sometimes that limit is, closer than you think." The reporter nodded enthusiastically, clearly interpreting his discomfort as post-race exhaustion. "Absolutely. And speaking of limits, how did you find the water quality in the Seine? There's been so much controversy surrounding it. At the mention of the Seine, Mislawchuk's stomach gave an ominous lurch. He opened his mouth to respond, but instead of words, a different sound emerged. A deep, guttural gurgle that seemed to echo across the finish area. The reporter's eyes widened. "Oh my, are you all right?" Mislawchuk tried to nod, but the movement sent a wave of nausea crashing over him. He could feel it coming, an unstoppable force of nature. Time seemed to slow down as he realized, with crystal clarity, what was about to happen. In that moment, Tyler Mislawchuk made a decision. If he was going down, he was going down in a blaze of glory. With the last shred of his composure, he looked directly into the camera and said, "And that, folks, is why you don't drink the water in Paris." Then, like Mount Vesuvius awakening from its slumber, Mislawchuk erupted. A torrent of Seine-infused stomach contents burst forth, arcing through the air in a spectacular display of post-race pyrotechnics. The reporter, caught in the splash zone, leapt backward with a shriek, her microphone clattering to the ground. Nearby athletes froze mid-stretch, their jaws dropping in unison. Spectators gasped, then cheered, apparently impressed by the sheer volume and distance of the projectile. The cameraman, to his credit, kept rolling, capturing every glorious second of the aquatic encore. Mislawchuk, bent double, continued to empty the contents of his stomach onto the pavement. Wave after wave crashed over him, each one accompanied by a sound that could only be described as a cross between a dying whale and a malfunctioning garbage disposal. The cameraman, bless his soul, kept the shot wide, capturing not just Mislawchuk's Olympic-level regurgitation, but also the growing circle of horrified onlookers. In the Olympic Village, athletes gathered around TVs, their post-event massages and ice baths forgotten. Jaws dropped, eyes widened, and a collective "oh shit" echoed through the halls. Within minutes, phones buzzed with notifications, as the clip spread faster than a rumor in a high school cafeteria. "Dude, did you see the Canadian guy?" an American swimmer asked his roommate. "He just turned the Seine into a geyser." Across the globe, social media exploded. Hashtag Seine, Spew, and hashtag Olympic Upchuck trended worldwide. Memes sprouted like mushrooms after a rainy day. One particularly popular image showed Mislawchuk's face photoshopped onto the body of a fountain statue, water arcing gracefully from his mouth. Late-night comedians salivated over the footage. "Looks like Canada's bringing home the gold in the 100-meter spew," quipped one host. Another suggested that projectile vomiting should be added as an Olympic sport, with Mislawchuk as the clear favorite for Paris 2028. But amidst the jokes and memes, a current of sympathy ran through the athletic community. Fellow triathletes nodded in grim understanding, sharing their own tales of gastrointestinal woe. "Been there, done that," tweeted a former gold medalist. "At least I had the decency to do it behind a porta potty." Back at the finish line, Mislawchuk finally straightened up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The reporter, having retreated to a safe distance, eyed him warily. "Are you finished?" she asked, her microphone held out like a fencing foil. Mislawchuk nodded weakly, his face a shade of green that clashed horribly with his red and white uniform. "I think so," he croaked. "Unless you'd like an encore." The reporter's nervous laugh was drowned out by a cheer from the crowd. Apparently, his performance had earned him a new fan base. Mislawchuk managed a weak wave, wondering if this was what rock stars felt like after trashing a hotel room. As medical staff ushered him away for a checkup, Mislawchuk's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to find a flood of notifications. Messages from friends, family, and complete strangers poured in. His Instagram followers had tripled in the last 10 minutes. Even his high school gym teacher, who'd once told him he had the coordination of a drunken giraffe, had sent a congratulatory text. Scrolling through the chaos, Mislawchuk's eyes widened. He'd gone viral, all right, but not for the reason he'd hoped. Instead of headlines praising his athletic prowess, news outlets were running with gems like, "Canadian triathlete turns Seine into personal puke pool," and "Olympic swimmer makes waves." with his stomach. Well, he muttered to himself, at least Mom can't say I didn't make a splash at the Olympics. As he was led to the medical tent, Miss Lawchuck couldn't help but wonder how he'd explain this to his future grandkids. Gather around, children, and let me tell you about the time I became an internet sensation by turning myself into a human fountain on live TV. The team doctor greeted him with a sympathetic smile and a bucket, just in case. How are you feeling, Tyler? She asked, guiding him to a cot. Miss Lawchuck opened his mouth to respond, but before he could get a word out, his stomach lurched again. The doctor, with reflexes honed by years of dealing with post-race casualties, thrust the bucket into his hands just in time. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say you're not feeling great, she said dryly, patting his back as he heaved. When the latest wave subsided, Miss Lawchuck looked up, his face a mix of embarrassment and resignation. You could say that, he croaked. I don't suppose you have a time machine handy. I'd like to go back and unswallow about half the Seine. The doctor chuckled, handing him a bottle of water. Sorry, fresh out of time machines, but I do have some anti-nausea medication that might help. As she busied herself preparing the meds, Miss Lawchuck's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, half expecting to see another meme of his face photoshopped onto Old Faithful. Instead, it was a message from his mom. Saw your big finish on TV. Your father and I are very proud, though next time maybe try for a gold medal instead of a golden shower. Love you, sweetie. Despite his discomfort, Miss Lawchuck couldn't help but laugh. Trust his mom to find the humor in the situation. He typed out a quick reply. Thanks, Mom. I was just trying to make a splash in my Olympic debut. Mission accomplished, I'd say. The doctor returned with the medication, which Miss Lawchuck gratefully accepted. As the nausea began to subside, he found himself reflecting on the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, an Olympic athlete in peak physical condition, laid low by a mouthful of river water. It was almost poetic, in a twisted sort of way. You know, he said to the doctor, who was checking his vitals, I always dreamed of going viral at the Olympics. I just thought it would be for my athletic performance, not my impression of a human fire hose. She smiled sympathetically. Look on the bright side. You've probably set a new Olympic record for most creative finish line celebration. Miss Lawchuck snorted. Yeah, take that, Usain Bolt. Your lightning bolt pose has nothing on my sane spew. As his stomach settled, Miss Lawchuck's thoughts turned to the inevitable media storm he'd have to face. He could already imagine the headlines. Canadian triathlete makes waves with stomach-churning finish. But instead of feeling dread, he found himself oddly at peace with the situation. After all, wasn't this what the Olympic spirit was all about? Pushing yourself to the limit, giving it your all, and sometimes, quite literally, leaving it all on the field? He decided then and there that he wouldn't shy away from the incident. No, he'd lean into it, own it, and maybe even have a little fun with it. After all, if you can't laugh at yourself after projectile vomiting on live international television, when can you? With newfound resolve, Miss Lawchuck sat up straighter on the cot. Doc, he said, a mischievous glint in his eye, how soon can I get out of here? I've got some interviews to do, and I think the world deserves an explanation for my impromptu fountain impression. The doctor raised an eyebrow. Are you sure you're up for that? You've been through quite an ordeal. Miss Lawchuck nodded. Absolutely. Besides, I've got some great material now. Did you hear about the Canadian triathlete who swam in the Seine? He was last seen in Paris, but he's expected to turn up in Marseille any day now. Miss Lawchuck chuckled, already imagining the groan-worthy puns he could unleash on unsuspecting reporters. As he prepared to face the media circus, he couldn't help but reflect on the broader implications of his aquatic misadventure. In the grand scheme of Olympic history, his stomach-churning finish would likely be little more than a footnote, a viral moment sandwiched between tales of record-breaking feats and heart-wrenching triumphs. Yet, in its own way, Miss Lawchuck's experience highlighted the intense physical demands and unpredictable nature of Olympic competition. Messages of support flooded in from fellow athletes, each with their own tale of gastrointestinal woe. A marathon runner recounted the time she'd christened a spectator's shoes at mile 20. A gymnast admitted to nearly recreating Miss Lawchuck's performance on the balance beam. Even a few swimmers chimed in, proving that no amount of chlorine could protect against the occasional mid-race rebellion. "Welcome to the club, mate," read a text from an Australian rower. "We've all been there. At least you didn't capsize your boat in the process." The outpouring of solidarity reminded Miss Lawchuck that, beneath the superhuman feats and sculpted physiques, Olympians were still very much human, subject to the same bodily whims and indignities as the rest of us, just with a much larger audience. As he scrolled through the messages, a notification popped up. His follower count had just hit 1,000,000. Miss Lawchuck shook his head, marveling at the absurdity of it all. He'd spent years training, pushing his body to its limits, all in pursuit of Olympic glory, and here he was, achieving viral fame not for his athletic prowess, but for his impression of a human sprinkler system. "You know," he mused to the doctor, who was giving him one final checkup, "I always thought I'd leave my mark on Olympic history. I just didn't expect it to be so literal." She laughed, patting him on the shoulder. "Well, they do say that true greatness often comes when you least expect it." Miss Lawchuck nodded sagely. "Ah, yes, the old saying. Some athletes break records, others break wind. I guess I'm in a category all my own." As he stood up, ready to face the world and whatever memes it had created in his absence, Miss Lawchuck felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. Sure, this wasn't how he'd imagined his Olympic moment playing out, but in a way, wasn't this the very essence of sport? The unpredictability, the raw human element, the ability to face adversity, or in this case, severe gastrointestinal distress, with grace and humor. He straightened his shoulders, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Well, Doc," he said, heading for the tent's exit, "I'm off to face the music, or in this case, the sound effects." As he stepped out into the Parisian sunshine, Miss Lawchuck couldn't help but grin. He may not have won a medal, but he'd certainly made a splash. And really, isn't that what the Olympics are all about? The crowd outside the medical tent erupted in cheers as he emerged. Miss Lawchuck waved, feeling like a rock star who'd just trashed a hotel room. A sea of microphones and cameras greeted him, reporters jostling for position. "Mr. Miss Lawchuck, how are you feeling? Tyler, can you walk us through what happened out there? Any regrets about your pre-race hydration strategy?" Miss Lawchuck held up his hands, silencing the crowd. He took a deep breath, channeling his inner stand-up comedian. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "I stand before you today as living proof that when life gives you lemons, sometimes you just have to